Hello there, fellow Toons. Welcome back to the Retro Media Nickel Show. Today, we'll be taking a look at one of Toontown's most respected and long-running characters, Mickey Mouse.
Doom and devastation to mankind! Truly, a tragedy has befallen all of us! The children! They're not like how we were when we were children! And that's bad, because... But how did this happen? We don't know!
Oh.
But are comic books a gateway to crime?
Oh gosh, I hope not. Crime is bad.
Is Dungeons and Dragons turning our children evil? We don't know!
That's even worse than if the answer was yes.
Rock and roll music exists! And worst of all, cartoons.
Yeah, cartoons suck.
Luckily, dear viewer, there is a solution. A new legislation mandating that all children's entertainment be filled with nothing but educational content.
So what you're telling me is that I can watch my favorite shows and come out of it smarter than before? Well, that sounds pretty sweet, actually. Let me see what's on TV and check it out. Oh, hey, Animaniacs. I love this show. I could totally get behind this show teaching me something. Ah, Yakko's World. Perfect. Let's listen in on it. I'm sure this will leave me perfectly enlightened and entertained.
United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru, Republic, Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Greenland, El Salvador,
Wait a second. Caribbean isn't a nation. It's a region made up of other nations. Well, let's just keep going then, huh? Greenland isn't a nation in itself either. It's a part of Denmark. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. San Juan is the capital city of Puerto Rico. French Guiana isn't a nation. It's part of France. Guam is also part of the U.S. He says Russia here, but he's pointing to the whole Soviet Union. He says both Yemens, but the unified state of Yemen was a thing already. He says England, which isn't a nation on its own, but points to the entirety of Great Britain as well. That's Cambodia, not Kampuchea. Just say Asia. Just one Korea. Zaire. That's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Cayman isn't a nation. That's a group of islands. And it's pronounced Cayman. Crete is an island of Greece. Transylvania? That's a region inside Romania. What? If this one song, which for all intents and purposes should just be a list of nations from 1993, has this many inaccuracies, did the show even teach us anything? In 1981, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as President of the United States, and as a part of his famous economic policies, one of the big tenets was deregulation. One of his biggest deregulatory practices involved television, what people could advertise on it, and when. Because you know what's great? Advertising. Just think of all the money you could bring in when you let people know that what you have is worth something. Now imagine that you didn't have a worthwhile product, you could just use ads to create your own demand. Because, after all, if they've already bought it, that's their problem now. So, after the deregulation and throughout the 1980s, there were many shows whose main purpose was to either launch a line of toys or to promote toys that already existed. Due to the pervasive and manipulative nature of the advertising, kids were begging their parents endlessly for plastic robots, army men, and sorcerers. This quickly made parents concerned for their children, causing many to join parental lobbying groups, such as Action for Children's Television. Also during the 80s, there was a mass moralistic hysteria called Satanic Panic, in which an increasing amount of people began to see all kinds of things in society as secret satanic corruption of children. And this panic caused inoffensive parental groups with realistic concerns to become hysterical and increasingly radicalized against harmless things, and end up doing an immense amount of harm to children while accomplishing nothing. Politicians saw it as advantageous to pander to these groups to secure them as voters, which they managed to do by fanning the flames of the panic, creating laws and holding tribunals. Wait a minute, so the people who had just deregulated TV a few years ago was now benefiting from the panic that they had contributed to? That's messed up. Which leads us to 1990. The Satanic Panic was cooling, but many of the same parental groups were still around, and Action for Children's Television was still lobbying Congress, managing to get the Children's Television Act passed within that year. The Act's stated goal was to make Saturday morning television more educational, so that any kid watching would go out of it having learned something. At least 12 minutes of educational content had to be included for every hour of television. Animaniacs premiered in 1993 on Fox Kids, created by Tom Ruegger, although he went uncredited, letting executive producer Steven Spielberg use his name to promote the show instead. Set on the studio lot of Warner Brothers, here follows the daily adventures of the Warner Brothers, Yakko and Wacko, and their sister, Dot, who was always on the end of the bros if you wanted to look for her. In-universe, they were created in the studio during the 1930s, but they were far too insane and weird for the studio to find any use for them. So, after a lot of struggling to catch them, they were tossed into the water tower, where they remained until, well, 1993, I guess. But when they come out, there's always some old fuddy-duddy in their way that they just have to mess around with. They're like three little trickster gods with how much they mess with people. But that's not all. This is a variety show. You'd never know what would happen, because the Warners weren't the only ones in the driver's seat. There was a veritable rogues gallery of characters involved, like the jaded and gruff Slappy Squirrel to the dynamic duo of Pinky and the Brain, to the hair-triggered Good Feathers, to the incredibly unfunny Minerva Mink. Although it makes for a very eclectic but always unique set of segments each and every episode. Of course, helping right along is its fantastically fast-paced animation and a perfect soundtrack that was composed specifically for each episode, always perfectly matching the tone and energy. And with people writing a show all about the main characters pulling tricks and outwitting those more powerful than them, what did you expect the writers to do when the FCC stepped in and started making demands over the content of their show? Although I suppose the FCC was really tricking us in the first place by saying this was something that cartoons needed to do. Well, while we're on the subject, why don't we take a quick look at how this cartoon so cartoonishly pranked everyone at once with what it considers educational content. Songs are easy enough to pick apart, so let's start there. Now, not every song in the show is educational, nor are they trying to be, but of the ones that are, you'll generally find that they fall into two categories. The first type is your list songs. If you have a song that's meant to teach you something, well, the best thing to do, I guess, is to list stuff. Seriously, list songs are the bread and butter of this show. The US President song gives a name and about a sentence for each president, sometimes with a little tidbit, although that tidbit can, not even be true, like suggesting that Gerald Ford fell down a lot when it was only once. Meanwhile, the Planet song is exactly what it says, it just tells you all the planets, leaving Uranus at the end for a joke, so, it tells you the names of all the planets, but it doesn't really say anything about them. Be Careful What You Eat is a list of ingredients, and despite its title, it doesn't tell you which of these ingredients are good or bad things to put in your body, or how much of each you should be putting in there in the first place. But even worse is that given the context of the song, a good chunk of these ingredients aren't even in food. If I was petty enough, I'd count the song all the words in the English language on here, but I won't. That'd be silly, and this is some pretty serious stuff here. The other kind of educational song is the non-list kind. There's less of these, but they tend to have even more issues, which I wouldn't think so considering that it's only about one thing usually, but no. Panama Canal gets so much wrong it's not even funny. It details the whole canal with a few stats, but of those stats, it gets the depth, width, and number of keys wrong. The Ballad of Magellan is hinged on the titular explorer not knowing where the East Indies are, but in truth, he knew the whole time. He was looking for a faster route is all. But I have to give major props to Lake Titicaca. No information about the lake, why it's important, what's even inside of it, just the song about how they love it, and why do they love it? The name. Bravo. Now for a quick brush with something that I will be petty about. These are the segments with the historical figures involved, where the Warners will bother any number of influential people throughout history. There's a few of them over the show's initial 5-season run, so how do they indulge children's brains into the lovely world of history? Here's your general formula. Pick a time where said historical figure was in the middle of doing something important, and make sure that the Warners are smack dab in the middle of it. That's all. Any other facts are free to play around with and shuffle in any way you want, if you use them at all. Abraham Lincoln is on a train ride to give his Gettysburg Address, but he can't think of a good way to open it. So luckily, the Warners are there to help him write his famous 4-score line. Albert Einstein is trying to remember his missing piece of his theory of relativity, although it's really his theory of mass energy equivalence since it's E equals mc squared. And the Warners, trying to sell cookies, accidentally help him remember. Michelangelo is in the middle of the painting of the Sistine Chapel, but the Warners come in to, of course, ruin it. And Pablo Picasso, right on the verge of creating Cubism, is all thanks to some art-related pranks by the Warners. But these are dubious at best, if you can even count them as educational, if you're asking me. But they feature historical figures, right? They even tell you where the figure was from and what year it was. That's gotta be useful for something, right? There's a level of devilish genius at play. The way they managed to make the songs catchy, memorable, and fun to listen to is outstanding, although heck if any of it'll teach you anything. The writers, composers, and artists have somehow managed to perfectly replicate the intricate dance of just towing the line close enough to make a fool out of someone else without them even knowing it. All the while, they still make the kids laugh and have a great time. Well, as far as I can tell, the only thing that this FCC ruling ever did was just make some useless window dressing around cartoons, just to make some overly temperamental parents stop bugging them, and to get some politicians elected. But we did get a pretty all-around good cartoon from it, so I can't be all that mad, of course. Still, it was clear to almost everyone that this wasn't working. I mean, how many shows have you seen where they just shoehorn in a "here's what we learned today" segment at the end of it? As a result, they shrunk down the amount of time they needed from 12 minutes an hour to 6, then down to 3, and, well, it ended up being less than 30 seconds per hour. Yeah. If you wanted to give up without admitting that you gave up, that's pretty much about as close as you can get, I'd say.